And now for our final keynote speaker of the evening. I'm about to cue a video. Last year we celebrated the 40th anniversary of the Charter of Rights and Freedom. Considering what is happening in our day, can you imagine if we didn't have the backdrop of the Charter to prop us up in this fight, to hold our leaders accountable? There would be no legal challenge possible. We'd be dead in the water. Mr. Peckford is the former Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador and the last surviving signatory of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. He has currently launched a lawsuit with other Canadians that alleges that the federal government of Canada has violated our rights under the Charter. Please help me welcome one of the founding father of Canada as we know it and how our children and grandchildren will know it, the Honourable Brian Peckford.
You're hungry for food, but I want you for the next 25 or 30 minutes to be hungrier for freedom. I, first of all, want to acknowledge the unbelievable work that Jonathan and his group do to put on this conference. I came to speak at this place, was it 2 years ago, whenever, when they were getting started. When Cam and Jonathan then were getting started and asked me to come down to speak. And it was a momentous occasion. The place was full. People were desirous to hear, was there any way out of this? We're very fearful, but yet looking for some hope and looking for some optimism. It was an electric kind of atmosphere. Of all of the Zoom and live appearances I've done, mostly in Western Canada because I couldn't travel, and there's been, I guess, close to a couple hundred now in the last year and a half. Two really stand out live ones. One was the one here, and the other was the one in Black Creek between Courtenay and Campbell River. Carol and I get up to the church. And you must know by now, as Mr. Lugosi talked about as being the foundation of freedoms, the Judeo-Christian tradition, that just about all of the speeches that I've done and others who support the Charter and support freedom were in Christian churches. But they were only in some Christian churches. They weren't in the mainstream Christian churches. They're with the mainstream media. It was churches like this one, in the same way with the one in Black Creek. The Black Creek one was quite something really special. I don't know if anybody here was there that day, that night. It was the first time I spoke there twice. The first speech I did, the place was full of people. And when we got there, not knowing that they had a place for us to park, we were looking for a place to park, and people ran over and sort of took our car and said, we can park it here for you. And as Carol and I were walking in the church, there were a lot of people standing outside. The place was full. And so people were coming along and shaking my hand and saying, thanks for coming, we're really glad you came, and others were saying it in a way that they thought I mightn't come. I guess they've had some bad experiences with some politicians over the years who didn't keep their promises. And so I was touched by that, and so was Carol. And Carol said, there must be some way we can get more people into this church and still not have the fire marshal close us down or whatever. So some of the organizers, as we're going into the door of the church, said, yeah, well, perhaps we can put them down along the sides or space on both sides over here like that and then down the main centers. And so we put people lying down, sitting down, small families sitting down, until I think we got everybody in, and they had to open up the thing upstairs, allowed them there, so we just about got everybody in. And what a cross-section it was of young families, older people, just people interested. And I said to them, as I did here, the first one here, this is going to be, perhaps I said 40 or 50 minutes. I've got to go through the history of the Constitution. I've got to go back to even before 1867, because we were fighting for representative and responsible government before Confederation in Upper Canada, Lower Canada, Ontario, and Quebec, New Brunswick, PEI, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. They had actual assemblies which had gained representative and responsible government. So this goes on a long time. But I said, I'm going to be, quite long. And people were nodding their heads. Teenagers right in front of me, 3 or 4 teenagers right in front of me, 17, 18 years old, nodding their heads. Okay. And so, and I know sitting down like that and listening to somebody that long is going to be tough. So, but stay with me. And it was absolutely unbelievable that you could hear a pin drop for those 40 or 45 minutes. And one of the things that was really striking when I talk about fundamentalist Christianity versus the so-called diluted mainstream people. By the way, I was brought up in the United Church of Canada, so I know what I'm talking about. Okay. If my dad was alive today, he would go right back to his grave again, because he wouldn't recognize what's happened to this organization. Because he sang in the church, and he played organ in the church, and he preached all over different parts of rural Newfoundland when he was a social worker, because he was part of the church. So I'm familiar with all that stuff, right, growing up. But when I mentioned in my speech about how there was this particular type of Christian organization that the pastor would allow us to speak there, I mentioned through my speech about the early Christians, and that how Carol and I had visited Turkey, and we had gone to Cappadocia by public bus and met a lot of ordinary, wonderful people. And we had an opportunity to go and visit some of the underground places that the early Christians had built. You should see the people in that hall who had part of their Bible study had been studying that. And afterwards, I don't know how many came up to me telling me stories about the early Christians in Ephesus and in other parts of Cappadocia, and how they were being persecuted by the authorities. An amazing electric time. And it was just, I would have liked at that moment to have of all of Canada somehow zoomed into that meeting, because if they had witnessed to what I witnessed that night, it would have made a huge, big difference. And anyway, I'm very pleased to be here, and I thank the pastor and the congregation of this church, and Jonathan and Cam and all the other organizers who made this conference possible. It's very, very important. 2 books, the 2 ladies, 2 sisters. I love books too, and it's something that you hit on something that was quite important to me. In almost every speech I give, I talk about a number of books. Turtles All the Way Down. Turtles All the Way Down. If you haven't heard of it, if you're in on my blog, you've heard of it, because I've done I don't know how many, 4 or 5 different essays or stories on it. If you haven't got the book, if you remember nothing else for the next 2 weeks about where you were, what you did, any time, don't forget Turtles All the Way Down and go buy it. It is perhaps the most important book that I've read in the last 20 years, 30 years. An amazing book. 2 people who remain anonymous in Israel wrote it. It was in Hebrew for 2 years before it even got translated into English by the Children's Health Defense, by the way, who helped translate it into English. And it's Turtles All the Way Down, Vaccine, Science, and Myth. And I don't know if any of you follow Steve Kirsch, the millionaire guy who he's been pushing this book as well, and has asked people to find fault with it, and he'll pay them if they can find fault with it. Nobody's come forward. Paul Alexander's also, Dr. Paul Alexander's also pushed the book. Somebody told me earlier today about it being highlighted in 4 or 5 different languages in somewhere in Europe. These 2 people remain anonymous because they know that if names were ever released, their jobs or might even be their lives would be in jeopardy. And so it's still anonymous. And when it came out in Hebrew in Israel, a local medical journal carried it, and before anybody was able to get at them to say you shouldn't be doing anything on this book, and so they published this very positive review of it, and I almost got destroyed out of it by the main authorities, because they said this is just a wonderful book. One other doctor in Israel at the time also had read it and said, oh my gosh, what a wonderful, wonderful book. And he was condemned from heights on high, and he actually offered money himself. But would somebody tell me what I did wrong? Would somebody show me somewhere in this book? Or something like that. There's 1,200 references in this book that you can access just by clicking on the computer and getting it. 1,200. Okay? Fantastic book. And one that fundamentally people have to read, because you've got to get at, as people were talking, you've got to get at the root of the problem. You've got to get at the root of the problem. We can't just go for the flowers. We've got to go for the root of the problem. And this book really goes for it. So Turtles All the Way Down, I can talk all night on it. The other one, which also was hit on a number of themes today, is called Surveillance Capitalism, by a female professor out of Harvard. And that deals with really how Google and the people who are the creators of all these algorithms got started, and how they were able to dominate the whole new electronic and internet scene, and use information as a commodity like we do fossil fuels or farm products or whatever. That the big commodity in the world today that is not open for trade because it's been captured by 3 or 4 companies is information and the internet. There's a wonderful, wonderful book, and really highlights all of the situations. As a matter of fact, I think the subtitle of the book is The Fight for a Human Future at the Front Line of Power. The fight for a human future at the forefront of power, of world power. These are 2 wonderful books. Is it possible in Canada today to restore our democracy? That's something that's been on my mind a lot in the last 2 or 3 months, because I'm getting pessimistic about that. And I'm not a pessimist. Churchill once said, I'm an optimist, there's no use being anything else. Well, we're on the verge of losing. We're losing it now. Many elements have been lost. The school in Parksville, the only high school in Parksville, turned down a speech I was to give to the students, which they had approved earlier. A teacher had the audacity to ask, given right in the height of the pandemic, have a resident of this community, Mr. Peckford, speak here, and they agreed. And the students were getting all organized, and a lot of the classes were dealing with the Constitution and the Charter. And 48 hours beforehand, the teacher who organized it all and who called me in the beginning to see whether I would do it or not, was called in the principal's office and said, it's off. Mr. Peckford is not going to be speaking in this school. I wrote the mayor and the council and asked them, I said, you know, you might have heard, some of you may have heard, you wouldn't have heard it on mainstream media, but that I've been briefing the MLAs in Ontario, in Alberta, in Manitoba, in New Brunswick, in Prince Edward Island, and so on, about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And you all know I live here in Parksville, and I don't want any of the council or the mayor or some citizen to think he's doing all this work. He's a member of here in Parksville, a citizen of Parksville, and he wouldn't even brief our own council. And so I wrote a letter to them saying, you know, you name the time and place, and I don't be too happy to give you a presentation on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, given that there's nobody else around who is a signatory to it, only yours truly, and I'm a citizen of Parksville. And the nasty stuff I got back was just crazy. And so I was turned down by both the council where I live here in British Columbia and by the local school. Thankfully, there are some really good small business people in Parksville, and some small business people organize a number of meetings in their facilities for me to speak to 50 at a time, which was really good. So, but they're underground, right? They weren't in the forefront. And they actually went to the Chamber of Commerce and said to the Chamber of Commerce, you know, the Chamber of Commerce wanted nothing to do with it. And so, but they did it on their own and continued to help the truckers and so on as they passed down from Campbell River, coming down to Victoria and so on, the small business people of Parksville. So there was a good group there, notwithstanding the leadership, both in education and in the municipal government there. But this is my own experience, and this is why, and with being only able to speak at certain particular churches, or the only space I could get. There was a group in Qualicum Beach where we had originally lived, Carol and I, for quite a few years, who contacted me and understood I was in Parksville now, but you know, you don't mind coming right next door to Qualicum to speak. And I said, you named the place and time, well, we're going to try to do it. We were going to do it in our living room, but it was only 10 or 15, and there's quite a few people have contacted us now and said, you know, let's get a space. They're still looking for one. There was a small businessman in Nanaimo. I spoke to churches in there too, two different churches. Once again, same kind of thing as here. But there was one small business who stood out, and we did have a meeting at a small business facility in Nanaimo. I point that out only simply to say, you know, is our democracy salvageable? Because my own personal experience would not lead to a very positive conclusion to that statement. So, and then if you look at the top judge in this country, who's steeped in evidence, who's steeped in being able to just say what you can prove, doing an interview with a Quebec paper, I guess he hoped it would never get translated into English, where he spoke in derogative terms about the truckers' movement. This is the man who yet, quite likely, will have to hear some appeal from the lower courts to his court, and without any evidence at all. He's still Chief Justice. There was a group of people, talking about accountability, there was a group of people, lawyers and others, who wrote the Judicial Council, of which I think Chief Justice was the chair. And they wrote back a letter. Don't say, nothing to see here. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I never, ever thought I would see the day when those kinds of things would happen in this country. And who wants to go and even mention the Prime Minister? 5 times he's broken the Conflict of Interest Act and is still allowed to sit in the Parliament of Canada. I'll come to that a little bit later in some of my solutions. Do you know, to get down to real practical terms, that this country, in order for you to get an electrical permit in this country, we're 122nd in the world in how long it takes to get an electrical permit. There are 121 countries in the world that are given an electrical permit when they apply for it, either municipally, provincially, or federally, however, in their countries, according to the World Bank. study on ease of doing business. This is the kind of stuff. Here in the last study that was done on Canada as it relates to people without a family physician or a health professional who they see on a regular basis. Could be a nurse, not even a doctor, just a nurse. God bless them, because the nurses have saved so many people through this situation. 30% people over 18 in British Columbia do not have a regular family physician. 21% average all across the country. Quebec, the Maritimes, and Newfoundland and British Columbia are the worst. Overall in Canada is about 22%. This is our vaunted healthcare system. Our wait times are some of the worst in all the OECD. And the business of value for money, as Cam, I'm sure, Bra would love to talk about, value for money, we're last. How much do we get out of how much we spend? Dr. Lugosi has written 2 papers, one he gave today, another one he will be giving tomorrow, in which he called me. He wrote the papers and wanted me to review them, and he puts my name down. He's generous enough to put my name down as Charles Lugosi with Brian Peckford, but he wrote them. I made a few minor suggestions or whatever. But he deals most fundamentally. He's the only person I know who, thinking the way we were thinking in 1981, and like he quoted me today to say, on the preamble. Preamble is all part of the Constitution in 1867. Somehow, the judges and lawyers and governments think it's not a part of the 1982 Constitution. And both have the same standing. What's going on? How come God has become a dirty word? About a half year ago now, or a year ago, I wrote on my blog, has God become a dirty word in this country? This is where we are as a nation. And I'm not sure, when I look around my own municipality and people that I know who will still at least say hello to me, but not much more, I don't think they get it. I don't think they realize the depth to which our country has fallen democratically. To change it is going to take a huge, huge effort. Right now, it's almost virtually impossible. So this is the other thing we've got to understand. You can't change the Constitution right now. Okay? Why can't you change the Constitution right now? You told us in different meetings that there is an amending formula. That was one of the things that was put in the 1982 Constitution, because we didn't have it in the 1867. That was the other reason why we needed the Charter, is because we had no way to amend it. It had to go back to the old country. And the Charter defines a way to change the Constitution. But what has happened, at least since about 1950, 55, is that the original project of Federation of Canada, Confederation of Canada, has been hijacked. I remember hearing John Diefenbaker speak. But you know, in 1957, 1958, as part of their campaign, the Progressive Conservative Party that I was a part of for many, many years, federally and provincially, announced hospital construction, provincial jurisdiction, treatment, all kinds of money being flowing. So the Constitution of this country, where it talks about the provinces being exclusive jurisdiction of the provinces, was falling apart then. Nobody addressed it. Nobody addressed it. And so where we are today is that there's something like $80 billion going out every year in both health, social services, and higher education from the federal government to the provinces. Now, if you're Manitoba, if you're Quebec, and Ontario only up until recently, and you're New Brunswick, and you're PEI, and you're Nova Scotia, you can't afford not to have this anymore. Like when you give the kids something, it's pretty hard to take it away later. But when you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars and we're able to balance the budget and so on. The amending formula is 7 provinces and the federal government have to approve to amend the Constitution. Where are you going to get the 7 provinces? That's why you don't hear of it now, only from somebody like me, because they all know they can't do it. Even mighty Alberta, with the present premier, who's now in an election, signed the new health deal and gets $2 or $3 billion a year from the federal government. And they had the change, if you will, or the money to do it on their own. And Saskatchewan and British Columbia have provinces, are still taking the federal money. So they cannot afford to upset the apple cart. So even if you wanted to, and you were yearning to see change in the Constitution as a way out of our impasse, you can't do it. And we're all, both our parents and us, everybody else, are responsible for that. Because we took the money and ran. This is where Alberta has a problem when they argue, don't you touch my oil and gas, but you can come in, give me some money on health care. Both of them are exclusive provincial jurisdiction. So they get a little bit of a hypocritical situation going on there, right? So we must therefore, and here's my main point, we must therefore rely on what can we do in the present framework. And we must stop going down rabbit holes where, oh, this is really not a country. Oh, you could have fooled me. I've been paying taxes to the municipality, which is a creature of the province, which is part of the 1867 Constitution, which was passed, legally passed, the 1982 and all of the conventions and traditions in between all that, the 1981 decision by the Supreme Court of Canada knocking down Trudeau Sr. from unilaterally patriating the Constitution was ruled how? Not even by anything that was in the 1867 Act. It was ruled because of convention. Because ever since 1867, if there was anything that was going to affect the powers of the provinces had to be consulted and the majority had to go along with it. And you hardly see that anywhere. When I bring it up and people ask me afterwards, they say, I never heard of that before. I never heard that before. They got turned down because that was it. So we are a country. So many people here were saying, the new leader of the Conservative Party mentioned today, he's a Canadian. He wants to see Canada succeed. He wants to see what succeed? Canada. Because we are a country. So those people are going down these rabbit holes of saying we're not a country and all that. There is very little rational, constitutional precedent for seeing that being a credible proposition to make. And the whole question of the monarchy coming back in. Oh, we can go to the Governor General, or we can go to the Lieutenant Governor, or we can go to the Queen, or now the King, and get all this changed. We can do that. See, that's it. Talk about reading. Some people need to go back and read the 1982 Constitution Act. I read that to some people, I don't know how many times, both on the phone, on Zoom, and on the email. The Canadian Constitution, Patriation Resolution, Section A, no act of the Parliament of the United Kingdom passed after the Constitution Act 1982 comes into force shall extend to Canada as parts of its law. Done. We're done. The monarchy are symbols of our past. They are part of our history and our tradition, but they have no more power over Canada. You wouldn't believe the hours I've spent on the phone and doing up emails or on Zoom calls, people still insisting that King Charles can change all this in a sleight of hand. You want me to give you a good, really good? You might have heard this story before. I wasn't telling it for a long while, but I sort of forced it. Want me to tell you a really good story? I'm Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador. I have 3 of my senior ministers, 3 lawyers, all brilliant people. One guy got his honors in law out of Cambridge while sitting in the House of Assembly in Newfoundland. That's how smart he was. And say, Premier, we got a very serious thing we want to talk to you about. No, don't do anything. Don't do anything rash. They knew me pretty well. Don't do anything rash. Don't get mad. Don't go after. The Lieutenant Governor has refused to sign a cabinet minute. I said, what? Get me a car and driver. I'm going to Government House. Get me a car and driver. I'm going to Government. Listen, we just need a couple more days. We've been down to see him a couple. I said, no. If you've been down to see him a couple of times, it's all over. Sorry. I got a car and driver, and I said, oh, we'll come down with you. No. No. I'm going down as the First Minister of this province, and I'm going to see, as I've had before, the Lieutenant Governor. And so I said, somebody call down, let them know I'm coming, have the doors open. Beautiful building. I don't know if anybody's seen the Government House in St. John. Beautiful Georgian building. Oh, absolutely. If you ever go to St. John, make sure you go there. Try to get a tour of the place. Beautiful place. Now, get a tour of it now for sure, because you know what happened. So the door was open. I walked in. I went past this one and that one and went to the, knew where the Lieutenant Governor's office was. Went in, closed the door, and sat down. And I said, Your Honor, I understand you have refused to sign. So now, talk about custom and convention, okay? How Trudeau lost in 81. This is now part of the custom and convention of Canada. A premier goes down, and he sees the Lieutenant Governor, and he says to him, sign that cabinet minute. Well, he said, you know, I had a few problems with some of this. I said, Your Honor, I forgot more about this than you will ever know. Had to do with offshore oil and gas and stuff, which I was a part of when I was minister, and I fought for years. And he looked at me and I said, you've got 10 minutes. If you don't sign that cabinet, I'm having a press conference. And I'm going to put the people of Newfoundland, represented by the House of Assembly, up against you, who are now only symbols of our past, and I acknowledge that, and I respect that, and have supported that. But you cannot. I was sort of proud that day that my first name was Alfred. Remember King Alfred? And the beginnings of Magna Carta and all that in England. So I said, I'm going to have a press conference. And I said, we'll see who wins this battle. So I said, I'm going to drive back to my office, and hopefully by the time I get back, you'll have it signed. Got up and walked out. I get back to the office. We just had a call from the Government House. The Lieutenant Governor has signed the cabinet amendment. Now, if there was ever any doubt if ever there was any doubt, let it now be dispelled, okay? Let it now be dispelled. Because I was one of, I'm sure, other premiums over the years who've never told the story of that happening to them, okay? So we've got to forget about all of that kind of stuff. I ran for politics in 1972, and the party would not support me because I couldn't win. Because nobody had ever won that constituency in its history, 150, 160 years. There'd never been a Conservative elected in that riding. So I'm used to battles. I was never supposed to be leader, and I was never supposed to get the Atlantic Accord, which, by the way, violated the Constitution. The court had already just decided a few months before that offshore oil and gas belonged to the federal government, and the province had no power over it. I was able to negotiate a deal which gave us the same rights as if we did have jurisdiction over it, totally violating what the court had ruled. Interesting, isn't it? Very interesting. So I'm used to battles. But this is quite something different. And here are my proposals. We've got to look, if people are interested in changes to the Charter or any part of the Constitution of Canada, it has to be a longer-term project. The country is not ready for it. The provinces are not ready for it. But there's a whole bunch of things. And sometimes I'm like a lot of you people who get an idea. Are you concentrating on that constitutional change because you really don't want to look at what you really can do now? Is this a conspiracy to not really do what we can do now? And when I mention, I've been through a lot of this before, but nobody wants to do it. So here are my proposals. Under the existing Constitution, what we can do now, today, tomorrow, next week, 2 weeks from now, 6 months from now, if we get together. Big if. If you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same. Remember? Kipling, if. Number one. Honesty. Got to be number one. What do I mean? Robert Kennedy, whatever you think of him, Jr., his first priority, if he becomes, right, in his campaign, his first priority is honesty. Go in on his website, you'll see it. Honesty is number one. Now, I mean honesty. I have, over the last number of weeks and months, disassociated myself with a number of organizations some of you might know about, because honesty wasn't present. Ethics wasn't present. Number one, under honesty, please every political party in Canada, provincially and federally, but essentially I'm talking federal right here now, but all political parties, especially those who have seats in the legislature, do audited annual financial statements on what happened to the money we gave you in your party. Not only where it came from, where it went, how it was spent. Do you think that's unreasonable? No. For political parties who are taking your money? We had, I'm sorry, but we had Mr. Scheer take money from the Conservative Party of Canada and use it to finance his kids in private school. Remember that? That's how he lost the leadership. He is the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada in the House now, a party that I was a part of for 40 years. How about this one that I already mentioned? No person can sit in an elected Parliament of Canada if they have broken the law as determined by an ethics commission or a court of law. You see how quick governments can bring in certain, or even sometimes oppositions, if they're on side with the government, bring in a piece of legislation that passed in 1 day or 2 days. First reading, second reading, third reading. Governor General got it signed, boom, all over in less than a week. They could do that tomorrow on the Conflict of Interest Act. The Conflict of Interest Act federally is in place. All they got to do is go in and put in words what I just said. I've written Polyev, I've written the NDP leader, written the Prime Minister. Don't even get an answer. Ask them, why won't you do that? Why won't you do that? I've actually sent the communication to their parliamentary office, afraid that some clerk or aide in the leaders of the opposition's office or the Prime Minister's office or the leader of the NDP office would put it one side so that the leader didn't see it. Sent it right to his own constituency office, figuring it might be a better chance. Both still haven't heard back. Can you imagine, I'm sure you can, what a difference just those two things would make in how you view politics? That you can go in online and one smack, you can do it for the PPC, by the way, to their everlasting credit, to Bernier's credit. Go in and look, you can see how much Bernier gets paid from the party every year. You can bring words, how much he raised and how he spent it. You can go in and get that right now. Just like that, go into the PPC website. You can't for any other party, federal party. And they don't even have a seat in the House, right? Just those two things alone would elevate the level of politics in this country. To know that your elected leaders now have got to be on their guard about how they spend your money, number one. Number two, how they behave, because they could no longer be an MP if they're found to be unethical by the Ethics Commissioner or a court. Mr. Morneau, for example, a former finance minister, he wouldn't have been able to sit in the House of Commons, nor, of course, our Prime Minister would have been gone long a year ago, just if that had been in place. And so it elevates automatically, right? It brings up the whole level of integrity within our government just by that. So this can be done right away. Parliamentary supremacy. And under that comes my number two thing that we can do right now. The Parliament of Canada can tomorrow pass a law restricting the numbers of people that work in the Privy Council office and the Prime Minister's office. You know, 1,500 working in the Privy Council office and the Prime Minister's office, all reporting to the Prime Minister. Meanwhile, he's got how many deputy ministers? 40 or 50 deputy ministers or deputy minister designation, who he also appoints, and the ADMs and so on. Why does he need another 1,500 when he got all these DMs and ADMs and all the rest of it? Sure, he needs some. But my proposal was bring it down from 15 to 500 and see how that works for a while. Right? See how that works for a while. Don't go to zero. Don't be unreasonable. I had staff when I was Premier. I understand you need some. Can you imagine a former Minister, Attorney General of Canada, Judy Wilson-Raybould, still wanting to appear before the committee, the parliamentary committee, and the NDP and the Liberals outvoted the others and shut it down over the SNC Lavalin affair, and for which she lost her job. Right? Parliament has got to retake its power back from the Prime Minister's office and from a lot of the cabinet ministers, and parliamentary committees got to be strengthened in their power so that the tyranny of the majority doesn't rule if there is still something substantial to be given or heard in a parliamentary committee meeting. The pandemic is a really, 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 really good example. There should have been a parliamentary committee in every provincial legislature overseeing what the Department of Health and those silly public health officers were doing. That would be democracy. We declare we're a parliamentary democracy. How can we be a parliamentary democracy if we're willing to pass the power over to the health minister, and then from the health minister to the public health officer who's not even elected. What's going on there? And all the MLAs just sitting around, MPs, listening to somebody else articulate what should be what they're articulating. This is an abuse of our system. This is not parliamentary democracy. Some of the people who fought for representative and responsible government in the 1840s, before Confederation, would turn over in their grave today to see how what's happened to that. Most of the small parliaments got representative government, in other words, right, you were represented in a parliament, but they didn't have responsible government whereby everybody who's in the ministry had to come from the House, had to be elected too. So that's the difference between representative and responsible. Representative is that you're represented in the parliament. Responsible means that everybody, the executive, the cabinet, also has got to come from the parliament. Some of the governments had that before 1867. Newfoundland had it in 1855. I mean, PEI and New Brunswick, I think, and before that, in 1840, 1845. This is not a new concept. So we need to get, and we can do that now. We don't need to change any constitution to do that. And we need to decentralize. Somebody in the book that some of you have heard me quote before, Democracy in Canada, the Disintegration of Our Institutions by Donald Savoy, he tells a story about somebody he met saying that the public service of Canada was like a whale that couldn't swim. A huge whale that cannot swim. Right? One time there was one MP equal about 10 public servants. Right now, one MP equals about 800. Our debt has gone, gone crazy in the last 10 or 20 years especially. Over $1 trillion just the federal debt. So we've got to get back to the Parliament operating almost all year. What a novel idea. Most people who are working get 3 weeks. Some people get 2 weeks. If you're in Western Europe, you might be lucky. You might get a bit more. Of course, they're not as productive as those places that don't have so many holidays. But so that's what the whole idea was, that we had people who were representing us in Parliament and who were making decisions on our behalf. And I have to say it, Charles, I don't know where you sit on this, or many of the lawyers. We got to get a different way of appointing the judiciary. There is no question now. If anybody had any idea that the judges were independent and we could count on them like we used to be able to count on our doctor one time, it's gone. It's gone. Keith Wilson, my lead lawyer in the first action that I took, asked the federal lawyers when we were getting ready to finish off the months and months of private debate between the lawyers submitting documents for both sides, and then they were going to have this public hearing. What day was it again? Whatever the guy's name was, one of the prosecutors for the federal government. Are you going to call Mr. Peckford? And looked at him. We had no intention of calling him. Here is a government of Canada who's being challenged by me and other Canadians. There's 5 other names on that statement of claim. Only First Minister alive who signed the Charter and who's now challenging actions of the federal government under the Charter. And they have no intention of calling him. The Rouleau Commission, which was a flawed commission, we get sucked in so easily. Here was a government examining itself. Here was a government examining himself. Meanwhile, the lawyers said to me, we're going to put your name forward as a witness because you were in Ottawa, you spoke to the truckers, you met with the truckers board. These heroic Canadians. And had a press conference that got aborted with Tamara Leash and so on. I had to secretly get down there. As some in this room know, go to a remote part of an airport to get aboard a plane and sneak down to Ottawa. Can you believe that? It just sounds like something's happening in the Ukraine war now. They just sneak down to Ottawa. Well, 15 hours later, 3 refills. I'm finally get down. So they put my name forward and I said to the lawyers, I said, you know, I'm going to, if in the unlikely event that I am recognized by the commissioner as being one of the witnesses, and I can understand, I think the first thing you know I'm going to say is, you're illegit, you're not legit, Commissioner. And they laughed. But he said, well, you put your name forward anyway, and of course, never even got considered. Right? Never even got considered. So these kinds of things have just got to stop. And so the judiciary needs reform in how it is established. And we can do that as well. I've gone so far in my Magna Carta, which is now a year old, which all of these things are in, and which hasn't moved 1 inch since I announced them and sent them out to everybody, that some kind of joint parliamentary committee, the Senate and the House of Commons, will be established to do as they do in the United States, have a hearing and ask them some questions. And should not, I know this goes against our British traditions, but should not the people be the final people decide who's going to be the judiciary candidate? Something has to change. Some of the decisions out of the court, like in Manitoba, were just ignored independent, really good experts, Dr. Brian Bridle, Dr. Peter McCullough, and others, who submitted unbelievable material. And it was just discarded. How about a system which allows for the lady over in Alberta with needing the organ transplant? Her last name is Lewis. Sheila, is it Sheila Lewis? Sheila Lewis. What she's going through some kind of administrative donor program in one of the hospitals. I mean, this lady is likely to die because they refuse to consider her because she's not vaccinated. So all of the superior judges that are appointed by the federal government, we're going to have to find a better system. Education. We should all force the provinces to pass a law which obligates a civics program in every public school or any school that's getting financing from the government in grade 8 and in every grade until they graduate from high school. Most of the MLAs that I briefed on the charter had never read it. I remember I was on a Zoom to Northwest Territories. A guy up in Hay River, freedom fighter, engineer guy, arranged to get a whole group together, somewhere on Zoom, somewhere in a small hall. And one of the people who was a part of the Zoom call was an MLA. And we got talking, about one thing and another, and I was proposing different things. And I said, well, you have caucus meetings, so why don't you bring up at the caucus meeting, this and that and something else. And I mentioned a number of government MLAs as well. There's so much thing that can be done in the system right now as it exists that's not being done. And so it's very, very easy to pass, for every province to pass in the Education Act. Just amend the Education Act to say there's one subject that's mandatory from grade 8 on, and that's civics, and define what you mean by civics. First of all, an understanding of Canada's governance system, municipally, provincially, and federally. I actually did it when I was teaching. I taught for 4 or 5 years. I brought it in on my own. I just brought it in on my own. I went to the principal and told him. He said, well, but he said, that's from like 3:30 to 4:30 while they're out of school. But I said, I'm going to say to them, I'm going to have a new program, a civics program, and here's what it's going to entail. And I wrote it all on the board, the old chalkboard, and we're going to start doing civics as a subject. One grade 8 class. There was only one grade 8 class in the school. And that was like in October, November. I don't know if there was a kid who ever missed that class as the bell rang for everybody else to leave. Students want to know. Students want to learn. Students want to learn. That's the other thing, is we don't know. Teachers, been so wrapped up by their unions, and you can do this and you can do that and you can't do something else. I introduced Shakespeare in grade 7. Once again, principal said, you can't do that. I said, well, I'm in the process of doing it. And unless you say no, I'm going to go ahead and do it, and I did. And they loved Midsummer Night's Dream. They loved As You Like It. And then they could see the growth of Shakespeare. Will Shakespeare from Stratford going to London and getting involved with these theatrical companies. And moving from, the fantasy world of Midsummer Night's Dream, to the lovers getting all crossed up and As You Like It, right? To more serious comedies like Twelfth Night. Moving on to the histories and then to the tragedies. So we never only saw how mankind has many different personalities and circumstances. We also saw how a playwright grows from being a comedy, one of comedies, one of histories, to one of tragedy. My point being, there's a lot of things we can do within the system. I know you're hungry, and you gotta go. Just a couple more, and I'm gone. Is the next point. Sovereignty. The most successful governance system for people in the world is the nation state. This business to try to put us into some all kind of international organization is full of you-know-what and should not be allowed to happen. Canada has got to stop joining or signing anything which in any way dilutes their sovereignty and our sovereignty. And we can do it. I mean, I tell the story about when I was in school and later in university. I loved history, especially economic history and stuff. The big trade organization, we think we're a big started trade. One of the essays a professor wanted me to do when I was studying classics was how the Greek Navy and the Greek trading arrangement with the other city-states enhanced the democracy of Athens. 390 BC. Trading has been around a long time. Right? In the Middle Ages, leading into the Renaissance and Reformation, there was the Hanseatic League. That was a group of city-states that were moving goods through the river system all the way from Genoa to Norway. And if you go to Norway and go to some of the coastal ports there, you'll see some of the remnants of the old Hanseatic League there. It was a trading partner. They were still independent states and never traded away into sovereignty. They did a trade agreement on goods and services that they could produce cheaper than their partner, and their partner could do other goods and services cheaper than they could. And so you did a deal. You did a trade deal. So I'm not talking about closing the country down. I'm talking about having a proud and independent country that knows it can sit at the table eyeball to eyeball with another and negotiate a reasonable trade deal where we move goods and services between our respective countries or respective continents or whatever. Not this business of suddenly having a bunch of unelected bureaucrats somewhere in Europe or somewhere in the world starting to tell us what we can grow and what we can't grow. Remember, one of the reasons why BRICS succeeded, why England never joined the European Union, was when the farmers of rural England suddenly realized that in order to know how many bushels of wheat they were going to have to grow next year, they had to check with Brussels. Some unelected person in Brussels was going to tell them what to do. And that helped fasten the movement towards not going any further that way. So people, some intellectuals, try to make you feel uneducated and you don't know what you're talking about if you laud the nation state. It's somehow not in tune in some intellectual circles. Well, I'm very proud to advocate that, yes, we need to have some common heritage, we need to have some geography, we need to have some history, we need to have some culture to bring peoples together into one country, and that country should be sacrosanct. That country should be otherwise your country breaks down because you don't know who you are anymore. I'll finish off by saying you got to get back to balancing budgets. You can't keep borrowing like this. You just can't do it. This is just crazy stuff. And it would just diminish us again as a nation and as a power. What is our dollar worth today? Vis-a-vis the U.S., which is in all kinds of trouble. People keep telling me the U.S. is in a lot more trouble now, and I say, well, what about the dollar? A little bit of a report card there. One time, I remember going to the United States when I was, I think, late teens or early 20s, when the Canadian dollar was more than the American dollar. Some of you were old enough to remember that. I think I was in Miami at the time. I went to Boston to see my aunt. Yeah, well, it was amazing. Of course, it's a lot, I know there's a lot more involved. But we've got to look at paying our way. We've got to look at paying our way. And if you want to classify that as old-fashioned, go right ahead. Go right ahead. It will be new fashion one of these days when we're on our knees and can't raise any money. Right? These are the kinds of things we can do today. But here's the kicker. Here's the kicker. These things can only be done if everybody comes together. From Prince Rupert to Bonavista, from Iqaluit to Niagara Falls, and starts one movement to have a clear definition of what they stand for and what they're fighting for. Guess what? I would say if that was ever done, if that was possible to do, within 5 years, everything I got on that list would be done. If we were committed, just take the 6. Don't enlarge, don't get anybody to enlarge it to 7. No. Here's my platform. Here's what we're going to do. You could get Canadians as a group to just dedicate themselves to reclaiming Canada through what we can do now, rather than some fantasy of what we may or may not be able to do later, seems to me to be a viable program for trying to save this nation. Merci beaucoup.